This is the second half of a two-part series. If you haven't seen the first yet, open up the link in the description in a new tab and watch that first, because there's probably a bunch of callbacks and running jokes that will make no sense otherwise. Anyway, we left off last video talking about Rhaenyra glaring at the audience, so let's get right back into it. Rhaenyra doesn't get to look her enemy in the eye at that moment, but it's a relatively isolated incident. Some of my favorite looks across Hot D are the many face-offs between people. This is as simple as it gets, the power move of staring down someone for various reasons, to see who, if anyone, will back off, or if they'll just stay staring at each other like a couple of freaks. While we're still on Rhaenyra, there's a great little teaser of potential and actual future conflicts between her and Daemon, when she tells him off for approaching Lord Grover so carelessly and impersonally. He initially looks uncomfortable and says that he'll fly off to treat with him directly, without asking Rhaenyra's leave to go. She immediately shoots him this look, which he returns, and they stare each other down while the convo carries on, neither one budging. Daemon still has issues with respecting hierarchy and authority. Aemond is obviously peak entertainment for this. He's only got the one eye, and he makes up for it by doing the absolute most with it. The reveal of his eye and the intense looks at Luke in general all throughout the scenes at Storm's End. Fuck me. Also, is he fucking high? Those pupils are insane. The absolute best, of course, has to be his face-off with Daemon at the supper. Hi, I modeled my whole thing after you, can you tell? Yes, of course I can tell. Is that foreshadowing, I sniff? Vaemond is almost as entertaining. I still piss myself every time he goes, "That!" His pointed looks at Rhaenyra and her kids all throughout his eulogy/blood lecture make everyone so uncomfortable. Swear down, like, give it a fucking rest, dude. It's a funeral. But Vaemond is an insanely proud and butthurt man, yet another victim of second son syndrome. Alicent and Rhaenyra are obviously big ones for this. I don't even need to go into too many examples here. We've covered enough of the litany of hurts they do each other over the years. Of particular note is the face-off between them at the small council meeting. Rhaenyra is desperate to get Alicent to back off about the obvious adultery, and Alicent is deeply offended that Rhaenyra would propose marriage between her only daughter and one of her bastards. Alicent and Rhaenys get a big one of their own, staring each other down when Meleys crashes through the dragon pit. By her own words, Rhaenys doesn't want to be the one to initiate bloodshed. Peasants don't count apparently, but it does appear to be a struggle for her. Personally, I think Alicent's words about gently guiding the men in power resonated with her. Her backing of Rhaenyra shows that she respects those who practice and preach restraint, and as much as she's furious about her imprisonment, she thinks Alicent can do more good than harm. For how weak Viserys usually is, it's notable in the moments when he chooses to stay steadfast and stare down his opposite. When he insists on Rhaenyra and Laenor's children being named Targaryen when they ascend the throne, there's a long one between him and Corlys. Viserys is a pushover and Corlys is proud, but they both have their limits in the end. Then when Lionel tries to quit, making vague allusions to his reasons why, Viserys looks him in the eye and demands that he say specifically why, knowing full well the reason and that he won't say it out loud, because he wants him to stay his hand, because Lionel is perfect and beautiful and strong. Lionel has some fantastic looks in both of these scenes actually. Yeah, we've briefly paused for a Lionel strong appreciation minute, by the way. When Corlys starts talking about the kids' names, Lionel reacts because he senses that this guy is asking way too many questions for somebody who's been offered a chance for his bloodline to ascend the throne. Then when Alicent keeps pushing to say very clearly why he's quitting, he shoots her this look like, "What's up, Rhaeka? Can I help you?" Lionel's always got Vizzy's back, and it takes him years to realize. Even looking at him all sus-like when he hands him the medicine, because Otto done gone and ruined the integrity of the position, and everyone keeps talking over him at the council meetings, and it's not fair because he's always right about everything. This is now the end of the Lionel Strong Appreciation Minute. Thank you for listening. As much as I'm annoyed we didn't get more antagonism between Corpo V and Laenor, the immediate antagonism between him and Harwin is so palpable. You know what? Let's break for a minute and properly examine. Is he actually a piece of shit? I hate to make a habit of sounding like I'm defending complete douchebags like Daemon and Aegon and now this guy, but I think it's worth noting how all these sons of bitches who do monstrous things are all completely understandable. I think that's a real credit to the writers. For a long time, Crimbo keeps his vows without any sign of wavering, and is having none of Rhaenyra's bullshit when she nicks his helmet, but he does give in and sleep with her, and the crisis he goes through clearly tears him apart, especially when Rhaenyra denies his proposal, rendering all his honor worthless. He's confronted, or at least he feels like he's being confronted, for his infidelities on 2 separate occasions. First by Alicent, and you can see the pure panic on his face when she mentions Rhaenyra. Then, after having watched Rhaenyra happily get betrothed to another man, coming to think that all his notions of honor, nobility, and loyalty are complete fabrications, Joffrey comes along, acting like a bit of a twat, implying that he knows his secret and requesting his support in exchange. If I didn't know any better, I'd think that was blackmail, and that's what seems to be what makes the guy snap. I always wondered why Cal Kestis and Harry were always so antagonistic towards each other, to the point where the former would be so ready to start a fight in the small council chambers after killing Beesbury. Being uncharitable, I used to think it was because he thought of himself as a good man, on the right side of truth and justice, but he soiled his white cloak on more than one occasion with murder and sex. Harry's Barristan-esque uber-righteousness seemed to me to get under his skin, a reminder of what a Kingsguard is supposed to be, and what he's not. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to see how pushed to the breaking point this man likely was. As a lowborn son of a steward, he's been looked down upon from the minute he arrived on the scene all the way to the end of the show. I can't help but cackle whenever I see this face Otto pulls when Alicent says she's making Columbine the Lord Commander. He's so appalled. When Rhaenyra asks them to identify someone who's had actual battle experience during the Kingsguard selection, Harry and Otto share a look, partly I'm sure because of the potential political ramifications of not choosing someone from a noble house, but listen to the tone of Harry's voice and the way he frowns at him.
Sir Criston Cole, son of the steward of the Lord of Blackhaven.
Motherfucker already doesn't like this guy, and Karamia notices with this glance. I also don't think it's a coincidence that he's having to look up from down below here. On the other hand, Code Veronica does seem genuinely bloodthirsty on more than one occasion. When one of the Ricks prepares to draw his sword, he looks at it and smiles. Either he's that confident he'll win a fight with him, or he loves to battle that much. It makes me wonder how serious he was with this offer.
You want me to kill him?
But he's not quite at Bronn levels of mercenary ruthlessness. When Alicent demands that he cut out Luke's eye, Harry looks at him like he's genuinely unsure how he'll respond. Given the man's track record, it's honestly 50-50, and his relief that he won't go this far is palpable. I also don't think he intended to murder Beesbury. After all, he did say, "Sit down!" and not "Die, bitch." Maybe his face-off with Harry is because he's kinda embarrassed that he accidentally killed a guy. Either way, Criston Cole is, at the bare minimum, a mix of good and bad. Back to the others. All the rest of those previous examples are pretty good, but no one is better at the classic stare down than Otto Hightower. Right from the start of the series, when he shuts down Corlys's concerns about the Stepstones, Corlys stares at him, then Viserys, as if to say, "You gonna let this guy do your strong-arming?" And then away when he realizes he's not gonna get anywhere with these people today. The antagonism between Otto and Corlys practically never ceases, and the two face off again when Viserys announces his intention to marry Alicent, with Otto looking at him like, "That's right, you little bitch." We've already been over the dispute between Daemon and Otto, but a particular one of note is the look between the two when Daemon comes home after the Stepstones. His presence alone is a spanner in the works. Daemon knows it, and he wants Otto to know that he's gonna make his life hell from here on out. You can easily tell his emotional and political intent in those looks from context, but this is Otto's default facial expression. He's like an older Welsh Ryan Gosling.
He does not act, he's not doing anything.
That's his secret. Like, all you have to know is what the movie's about, and then he just has to look like this, and then you think he's thinking that.
In a world where a man loses his father.
And then it's just his face going. And then you go, "Oh man, Ryan Gosling is sad."
His lack of reaction to the majority of situations makes him almost impossible to read, and an endless mystery. Sometimes I want to believe that Otto doesn't have any malicious intent, and he's advancing his own house's interests out of a sense of duty, the way I would expect from anyone else with a position at court. He's not afraid to present information in a biased manner, but as far as I'm aware, he never lies. That's not to say he doesn't express himself physically. Otto has this really distinct snake-like movement he makes when he's intrigued or he gets a sniff of advantage, leaning forward and maintaining unbroken eye contact with the person he's speaking with, almost as if he's trying to hypnotize them. The only thing that really seems to force a facial expression from him is when Viserys calls him out for the way he dropped Alicent in front of him in the midst of his grief. Perhaps he's feeling himself lose a grasp of his power over this situation, and Viserys in general, but perhaps he also feels guilty about his manipulation of Alicent. I don't know, maybe I'm being too forgiving. But elsewhere, Otto is arguably probably the most intimidating character to other people in the show. Literally just stepping forward and staring is enough to inspire fear in one of the Ricks. Even though Alicent ostensibly won the dumb race to get hold of Aegon first, apparently dictating his entire approach to kinghood. What was up with that, by the way? Otto still has power, his look commanding Aegon, as he always has. The only person, it seems, who has the ability to stare down Otto is Mysaria, giving him this intense, drawn-out look when he promises to look into the child fighting pits. It's only Mysaria that has power over him, which is why he probably had Larys burn down her house in the end. All of this staring all the adults are doing to each other was bound to rub off on their children, and that's really the saddest thing about the whole affair. The seeds were already sown, with the kids staring each other down across the throne room during the petitions, trying to look intimidating and serious, but they're all so cute and squishable. Well, all except Aegon, he's just fucking not in the room. At Viserys' supper, the adults finally decide to, at least for the time being, set aside their grievances and make peace. But the damage is already done. A rude comment here, a cruel joke there, just the kind of shit children do. Except these aren't normal children. They're young soldiers itching to start their own war, without the years of suffering their parents know. But they're still so adorable. Look at the way Jace is standing with his fists like a grumpy little tot. As we build up to the encounter that will trigger the war, the rivalry between Aemond and Luke is simmering barely under the surface as they watch each other closely. Without the influence of their parents, they're left to navigate their own conflicts, which goes about as well as you'd expect from these two, and the cycle continues once again. But alongside all these wonderful little looks, you have instances of people notably not looking, and this is where we'll start taking steps into the metaphorical. First though, the literal. The first time they see the near-death, ruined Viserys, Daemon can't bear to look at him for more than a moment at a time. I think it's part that he can't stand to see a Targaryen so weak, and part he can't stand to see his brother so ill. But when Viserys arrives to save the day, and he helps him up to the throne, he lingers, this time unable to take his eyes off of him, desperate to make sure he's okay, and when you look at that, I'm crying again. Speaking broadly, characters often avoid looking out of embarrassment or shame. Rhaenyra, returning off schedule from her series of The Bachelorette on tour, notices or perhaps anticipates Viserys' displeasure and avoids looking at him, attempting to stay out of sight near the back. It's really a sign of her continued immaturity. She knows he gon' be mad and feels guilty enough to avoid him, but not enough to do her duty in the first place. Then there's this bunch of absolute jagweeds getting all flustered over a little bit of titty leakage, including the fucking family physician, some doctor you are. Maybe they see it as being polite, but you're making her feel all self-conscious in the middle of her speech, you geese. Coming back to the ideas of desire from earlier, not looking plays a huge part in the sexual encounters the night of Daemon's return. I covered it a bit earlier, but Viserys making Alicent look at him, only for her to look away again, because she swears she saw a rat earlier and by Jove she's gonna get it. Plus her looking away while Larys beats his meat to her little piggies at market, contrasts wonderfully and awfully with Rhaenyra devotedly gazing at Daemon when she's younger and when she's older. Then you have Crackerjack avoiding eye contact, from his decision to stay with her all throughout the build-up to kissing Rhaenyra. He feels immense shame at wanting this and doing this, and it's tragic on an almost Grecian level that he feels he can resist that desire and prevent that guilt from consuming him if he just doesn't look, the way he launches up to kiss her. But the guilt stays throughout the morning after and up to his meeting with Alicent, where she questions him about the night. Perhaps he also feels as though if he's able to avoid looking anyone in the eye, he can keep his secret and no one will know his shame. His guilt wins out in the end though, and when he confesses, he looks Alicent dead in the eye, done with his hiding. Speaking of cock-a-doodle-doo, his line,
Don't look, princess.
when the Bracken and Blackwood lads start stabbing each other, speaks to his desire to shelter Rhaenyra from the extremes of life, perhaps as an extension of his Kingsguard vows, and perhaps because he sees her as someone needing protection. But she chafes at the restriction of being told what is and isn't something she should look at, especially in a patronizing way like this. Bit of a season 1 callback as well.
Look away, Khaleesi.
Actually, like a whole lot of season 1.
Don't look away.
Look at me! Look at me!
Look at him.
Look at him!
Most often, people are avoiding looks in an effort to hide some vulnerability. When they rock up to high tide for the proposal, Rhaenyra's understandably curious about Laenor, but doesn't want to appear interested given how opposed she is to arranged marriage in principle. So when he looks her way, she does the whole, oh look, a bird routine. Daemon's inability to look Viserys in the eye for more than a few seconds, when he says that he doesn't need anything from him, screams out how much of a lie that is. And Rhaenyra looking away from Vaemond as he turns to confront her, speaks speaks to the rush of indignation and humiliation she must feel at being shut down just then, and at having to do this in the first place. One that absolutely messes me up is Harwin saying goodbye to Rhaenyra. All throughout their earlier scene when Harwin meets Joffrey, they're sharing these adorable little looks, and he looks like he can barely contain himself when he asks to hold Joffrey. When it comes time to leave, he's looking at her steadily the whole time, as if he's trying to commit her face to memory, while she's avoiding eye contact as much as possible. She doesn't want to break down or lose her composure, whereas he has much less problem wearing his emotions on his sleeve.
Say it again! Say it again!
The relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra is full of these, mainly with Alicent turning her back on people as an indication of her displeasure. You can see that in this scene where she turns away from Rhaenyra, I think to help her think clearly and avoid her tendency to feel sympathetic for her. And in this scene where she turns away from Larys, a relative stranger, to maintain her outward composure and avoid him seeing her so hurt by Rhaenyra's lie. That's pretty much the pattern for a decade until the night of Viserys' supper. Both women sit at the table staring dead ahead, too proud and hurt to break their stony silence or even look in the other's direction. But they both, at separate times, make furtive little glances at each other, hinting at their mutual desire to have that relationship they once had and then lost. And after Viserys' speech and their apology toasts where they relate over their love of family, they can finally face one another, literally able to see eye to eye once again. Aww. Physically not looking is one thing, but the idea of deliberate blindness permeates the themes of the show. In her little chat with Otto, Mysaria talks about the Goldcloaks turning a blind eye to the child fighting pits in Flea Bottom, matched by the Rick who knew about this turning away from the other Rick's accusatory stare, ashamed at having tacitly protected Aegon's monstrous actions.
You Goldcloaks take the bribes given them to look away.
The majority, though, are regarding people fucking people they're not supposed to fuck, but not in a way that anyone can call them out for. Take all the uncomfortable reactions to Corlys snapping at Carl, especially Vaemon's. Everyone obviously knows the truth, including Corlys, but no one can even act like they know, let alone say it out loud. Then there's Rhaenyra and her very white children. Perfect, wise, sweet Lionel Strong of course says it better than I ever could.
People have eyes, boy. Yet his grace the king, it seems, will not accept what his eyes say. The willful blindness of a father towards his child.
I got nothing more to add to that. It's such a great change to make the Velaryons black, so that it's particularly noticeable the children aren't Laenor's, mainly in how it makes Alicent more sympathetic.
She expects everyone in the Red Keep to deny the truth our eyes can all plainly see.
Her frustrations become a lot more understandable, because it's not just a suspicion, it's obviously true, and yet everyone except Cocoa Puffs and Larys is essentially gaslighting her. Add that to what she herself says, that she did everything that was expected of her despite her personal misgivings, forced to be a tool for men's desires, or otherwise face drastic punishments, and yet Rhaenyra breaks every one of those rules and escapes reprisal. It even gets to the point where her son losing an eye is less important to everyone than pretending Rhaenyra didn't have an affair, and her breakdown into murderous violence makes a hell of a lot of sense after all of that.
Just look at them.
Nothing but elephants in this room. Cersei would be so wet.
I wanted those elephants.
Group reactions like this are probably the show's most effective way of conveying character. Someone says or does something, and you get a rapid read on everyone's stance on the subject, and who they align with, all through a couple of looks. It's an incredibly efficient way of doing things, when dialogue would take longer, and I understand a lot of GOT and Hot D viewers find it hard to remember the hundreds of characters and centuries of history, as well as past the lightly archaic language and strange names, so having non-verbal cues to guide you on how you're supposed to feel about all this is a big help. It's also in keeping with the show's style and themes, subtlety, intrigue, and deception, with a focus on what's not said as much as what is said. The first episode is absolutely stacked with great ones of these, especially throughout the tourney, given how much it needs to establish for the events to come. We've been over the Queen Who Never Was line and Boromund's subsequent unhorsing from Rhaenys's perspective, but it's a goldmine for other characters. Corlys has an "oh no he didn't" look at first, and then he has this hilarious little moment with Rhaenys when she sits back down. Otto is like, how the fuck are they allowed to get away with that? Viserys takes it personally as well and does his little pain smile, and then when Boromund gets taken out, he's like, again! These little looks carry on when Daemon chooses to face off against Gawain in the joust. Viserys turns to Otto like, hey, this is about you. Did you know? Did you know? That's my brother, who has almost unlimited protection to do what he wants, deliberately trying to fuck your family over. Did you see that? Did you notice that? And Otto's like, yes, of course I did, Vizzy. Of course I did. You've also got Corlys in the back, having previously been shut down by Otto and the small council, looking at him like, like I don't believe in karma, but it sure would be interesting if you got beaten here. After Daemon takes Gwaine out, Viserys shoots Otto this kinda embarrassed, sympathetic look. As much as he backs Daemon as his brother, he feels for Otto, and people in general, and he also doesn't want the strife this conflict will bring. My favorite ones in this scene, though, are Alicent looking to Otto for comfort and reassurance, and him gently signaling that it's okay. He's a cold man, but you can imagine that Alicent didn't really have any reason to resent him until Emma dies. Regardless, you can see a glimpse of how afraid Alicent is to displease him when she glances at him before giving Daemon her favor and doesn't get any reaction whatsoever, which is 100% worse than anything else he could do. It's not just a way to let you know how each character is aligned, however. Some of the best group reactions occur in tense moments that no one wants to say anything in, so they just look. Because if you talk about the inciting thing, then emotions might rise, and people will forget to be polite, and wow, this is the most English show I've ever seen. Take everyone's reactions to the rumor that Rhaenyra's kids are bastards being brought up. It's like, oh yeah, the thing we're not supposed to talk about. We're now talking about it. Fuck. In the same scene, you have Aemond looking at Alicent when he's asked where he heard it from, indicating that he might have heard her call them bastards. The pure panic on Alicent's face in response, and the tense looks from Viserys and Rhaenyra as they wonder if she could actually get caught out in this.
Look at me.
Wherever Rhaenyra goes, she brings these about, given her tendency to commit the awful crime of speaking her mind. Sometimes I'm on her side, like when Viserys, Otto, and Harry share some awkward looks when Rhaenyra suggests using dragons to make a Cajun boil out of the crab feeder, before shuffling her off to the fighter select screen instead of talking through her idea. Other times, she's just being a bit rude, like when she sasses Lady Redwine at the hunt, prompting these uncomfortable looks from everyone. Sometimes it's her mere presence in the wake of a controversial thing she'd done, bringing about awkwardness, like her premature return to King's Landing from her tour. Couple that with the small council meeting where news breaks of Corlys planning to marry Laena and the Sea Lord of Braavos' son, and that they'll need to make their own marriage offer. Everyone's aware of Rhaenyra's less than cordial approach to the concept of marriage pacts, and how much trouble that's brought Viserys. Given she sat right there, they all stay silent and make the exact same eye movements. Daemon is much the same, but definitely worse, with his classic move being to casually stroll back into the throne room, having previously been banished, first when he wins in the Stepstones, and again at Rhaenyra's wedding. He just rocks up with no warning, leaving all the onlookers to worry about what he's gonna do or say next. It's just like family get-togethers in our world, constantly on edge, waiting for the creepy uncle to say some fucked up shit. While at the wedding, Daemon basically takes a massive dump on Gerald and his grief, then adds salt to the shit by claiming the man's family's ancestral seat in the process. It's such a dick move that honestly gets lost amongst all of Daemon's other dick moves, but it might be one of the worst things he does in the season, and Lionel and Viserys' reactions are so relatable here. They think he's such a scumbag, but again, it's a wedding, can't cause a fuss. It's excellent groundwork for how bad of a starting position the Blacks find themselves in at the start of the war, given Daemon and Rhaenyra spent most of their lives alienating everyone around them, and managing to secure only a single Great House's support out of their 4 potential marriage alliances. This is why everyone tries so hard to be polite, de-escalate, marry rivals, and make friends in this world, so that it's harder to draw lines in the sand between them and us and start a war between the two. It reminds me a lot of Tyrion in Season 2, feeling oh so clever and powerful, pissing off Cersei, Tywin, Joffrey, Pycelle, Littlefinger, Janos, and Lancel, and having them all turn on him after Blackwater and during his trial. They're not always intentional, these little faux pas, and completely innocuous lines like Viserys' one about baby Joffrey having his father's nose elicit reactions from everyone else in the room. Even prim, perfect, and proper Alicent can't help but trip on a poor choice of words occasionally, like when she cheerfully says that Aegon's birth wasn't that bad. The wet nurse immediately gives a little sideways look at Rhaenyra, probably having heard about Emma's many lost children and the circumstances causes of her death. Rhaenyra gets pissed off and goes distant, having previously shown a bit of concern for Alicent earlier and now being hurt for it. Viserys, having started the trip happy as a clam, now becomes somber at the reminder of Emma, all from one innocuous line from Alicent, expressing gratitude that she didn't have too much of a shit time giving birth. Sometimes, of course, because this is politics, the implications of comments and actions like this are intended, much as the younger Alicent avoided these as much as possible and rose above the ones Rhaenyra would throw her way, like in this scene. Once she turns on Rhaenyra, she seems to positively thrive on it. When she gets up and leaves the table immediately after the first dance at the wedding, everyone stops and watches her leave. They don't need to show any emotion in the noticing, just that it's something to be noted, and you get the impression that this is unlike Alicent and possibly quite rude. That's nothing compared to her request to see baby Joffrey immediately after Rhaenyra gives birth to him.
I would like to see the baby.
Everyone immediately freezes up and sits in silence, while Rhaenyra processes and decides what to do. Lionel and Viserys, being mostly the only people trying to keep everyone from attacking each other, are litmus tests for when things get a little dicey. From their looks, you know that they both see what the Velaryons are implying about Rhea's death and Daemon's involvement in it, and their faces fully drop when Crumpet and Harwin start getting aggy in the training yard, the pretense that this is all a great bonding experience for the kids dropping away. In the small council meeting later, when Rhaenyra says they should get involved in the Bracken and Blackwood bullshittery, Alicent interprets it as less of a stance on the subject itself and more as an opposition to Alicent, who dismisses the matter entirely and mutters a little, Rhaenyra's death stare could cut through titanium, and Lionel looks like he wants to die before swiftly changing subject. The focus is on him turning to look at Viserys, who's doing and saying nothing throughout all of this, naturally, as if to say, get your house in order, dude. As usual, you can see both sides in this conflict. On the one hand, Rhaenyra has seen firsthand what happens when Brackens and Blackwoods get aggy with each other, so she could be sincerely wanting to get involved and prevent a small-scale war. But earlier she was so blatantly bored by the whole affair that for her to suddenly get invested after Alicent picks a side is fairly sus. Likewise, you'd think she wouldn't be keen on antagonizing Alicent, given she plans to propose a betrothal between their children later in the meeting, so for her to oppose her here would be a sign of genuine investment. But on the other hand, these two could truly be that flippin' petty. Probably the best instance of this would once again be Vaemon's fucked up little eulogy. Everyone's all grieving at first, except Aegon, of course, the absolute shitheel, until Vaemon starts making very pointed remarks about Velaryon blood, making direct eye contact with Rhaenyra's sons. Rhaenyra's like, oh fuck, that one's aimed at me. Viserys is like, fucking really, dude? Everyone looks like they want to say something to the guy, but much like Daemon at the wedding, it's a funeral, can't make a fuss. Well, Daemon can, the little psychopath.
We must all mourn in our own way.
Kinda tragic that all these second sons with identical names, Daemon, Vaemond, Aemond, and Otto, can't find some kind of common ground, and instead resort to battling each other almost as much as they do their own brothers. This is a long shot, but are there any people out there who've A, seen the 1998 two-part Merlin TV miniseries starring Sam Neill, and B, agrees with me that Aemond is a one-to-one copy of Mordred? If you fit into that bracket, please sound off in the comments so we can get together, because you my people.
Stop fussing, Mother. Auntie Mab understands, don't you, Auntie Mab?
I was merely expressing how proud I am of my family, Mother. Though it seems my nephews aren't quite as proud of theirs.
But these are all instances where something provokes a universal reaction from everyone. The variety of looks people give in response is often a lot more compelling. During the wedding dance, Rhaenyra looks at Keegan and Viserys looks at Alicent. The Targaryens are both very fucking pleased with themselves and want their partners to be as well, but they're in the pits of misery and rage right now, which the Targs notice, but can't or don't want to do anything about it right now. The same thing happened earlier, with a couple of cuts contrasting Rhaenyra, Viserys, and Laenor's contentment, and Alicent and the side pieces' discontentment. I adore this bit in the King's Road throwback, after Alicent makes the joke about Laenor entertaining his squires. Corlys and Rhaenys immediately give her the death stare, Crabapple chuckles to himself, and Harry looks over like he's sincerely regretting ever selecting him as a Kingsguard nomination. Wait, is that how that works? Do you get selected for a shortlist, which you can choose to accept, or do you volunteer? Harry talks about testing accepting the nominations, so there's got to be some kind of entry criteria. I always thought that Harry was the one vouching for him and ended up regretting it, and I can't see Otto picking anyone that wouldn't be a political plus, which Cray Cray isn't. Can some Arswife nerds sound off in the comments to sort this all out? Thanks in advance. Anyway, after all this strife and infighting, the only thing that brings everyone back together to share the same feeling is Viserys putting his life on the line and being a goddamn king. When he walks up the throne room, as much as he's here to disrupt the plans of half of those present, no one actually likes to see Viserys like this, suffering and struggling. His whole problem is that he's as inoffensively nice as he is, trying to please everyone, and no one can stay mad at someone like that. Everyone except Vaemond, who has his plans utterly dashed by Vizzy, and decides to commit suicide by talking about the thing everyone wasn't supposed to talk about. The shock and anger in response to his god-tier "bastards" line is fantastic, as are all the reactions to his sudden death. Aemon's face throughout all of this is just mwah. Once Viserys is overcome by pain and carried out, both Alicent and Rhaenyra look after him as he leaves. They both care for him, enough that it overrides all of their personal beef, which ends up being the whole theme of the supper scene. Viserys actually makes this clown car of big personalities look ashamed for all their squabbling, or at least guilty for making this sweet grandpa unhappy, humbled in the face of his genuine love. Even after his death, amongst the people who were plotting to shit all over his living will, I read the sad reactions to the news of his death as partly genuine. Sure, they might be nervous about the impending succession crisis, which they're about to cause, and Tyland's awkward about complaining at needing to get out of bed, but I also think no one there actually disliked King Vizzy. They just didn't respect him as a political force. But it's not just smaller groups like this. The show also revels in the looks from larger crowds. These really only come in two forms, the first being a signifier of where public attention currently sits. The most notable of those has to be Alicent arriving late to the wedding, drawing the eye of everyone in the room. She takes all attention away from Viserys' speech and the wedding, diminishing his reminder of Valyrian dominance and establishing her own status as a figure at court worth paying attention to. I love how Viserys pulls the exact same move on her years later, drawing all eyes to him as he makes his way down the throne room, upstaging the carefully orchestrated sham the Hightowers have put on to make Vaemond the heir to Driftmark. Even the crowd's looks are loaded with meaning beyond the simplicity of looking at something of note. When Luke and Jace turn up in the training yard, they cause a bit of a stir among those gathered there, no doubt gossiping about their rumored parentage and the situation that brought them here. Luke even points their staring out, clearly uncomfortable, but Jace dismisses it, just like Rhaenyra did so many years ago. We're talking mostly about the noble crowd here, rather than the small folk, in case that wasn't clear. Although both crowds are extremely fickle, tending towards a sheep-like reaction to public events. Take the tourney to celebrate Balon's birth, where everyone is delighted to witness the organized sports, but even more delighted to witness the brutal violence that erupts afterwards. There's a curious dichotomy there, with even the Velaryon kids looking bloody thrilled to be witnessing such gruesome acts, speaking to how desensitized to horrors these people are from a painfully young age. But Rhaenys also says that
it's been 70 years since King Maegor's end. These nights are as green as summer grass. None have known real war.
They simultaneously see too much and know too little. They see violence daily, but within the safe confines of a fun tourney up in the stands, but know nothing of the terror of war, where the violence comes right to your doorstep whether you volunteered or not. For that, just take the looks of horror from onlookers at the wedding as Christmas kills Joffrey. The anonymous political throng is hungry for blood, right up until the point where they're close enough for it to get splashed on their nice clothes. There's a wider point to be made about the individual and the collective when looking at Arswife and Hot D, but that's not really within the scope of my really narrow looks premise. My favorite crowd reactions are more metaphorical in nature, representing the weight of expectation on the royal family from their vassals and the wider political crowd. The third episode is almost entirely about this, charting Rhaenyra, Viserys, and Daemon's struggles with everyone looking to see what they'll do in any given moment. Rhaenyra dealing with the expectation that she'll marry, Viserys with the expectation that he'll name Aegon his heir, and Daemon with the expectation that he'll lead his army to victory. Conflict first simmers between the family under the weirwood, and in the carriage on the way to the hunt, with Rhaenyra talking of how all the attention is on Aegon today. But it doesn't begin to boil over until Rhaenyra confronts Viserys over Jason's proposal, and they begin shouting shouting at each other, prompting curious and awkward looks from everyone else in the tent until Otto suddenly reminds them that they're in public. Then, you have a multitude of stares from the crowd as Viserys talks to the huntsman about the White Hart and its royal significance, discussing what a meaningful portent this is for Aegon's birthday. Nudge nudge, do you get what we're saying, Vizzy? The pressure to name Aegon as heir is heavy and oppressive, coming from all sides, and all he wanted to do was have a family barbecue. I already brought up how Alicent looks in on Viserys throughout this episode, first from afar, but gradually getting closer and closer until she's right next to Viserys and allowed to read his political correspondence, essentially becoming a member of his inner circle. But that's contrasted wonderfully with Viserys' gradual isolation from everyone else as they nag endlessly at him, starting right in their midst at the Red Keep, before pushing away Rhaenyra, Otto, Jason, and everyone else who might approach him in the tent, standing alone in front of the fire before Alicent joins him, and finally left all alone to kill the stag. That scene where he kills the stag with all the other nobles and huntsmen looking at him is so fantastic. There's a vague distaste at the whole affair. No one really likes to see the actual killing done. It's a means to an end, after all, that being meat if you're being literal, and seeing their political goals of Aegon becoming heir achieved if you're being metaphorical. Viserys certainly doesn't like doing either of these things, but it's what's expected of him.
Even I do not exist above tradition and duty, Rhaenyra.
So he grits his teeth and gets it over with. Viserys spends much of the show pondering his dream of a son ascending the throne, and at this point in time, he's at a crisis, having previously thought it simply a delusion after Balon's death and naming Rhaenyra his heir instead. But now he has another son, named Aegon of all things, throwing a massive spanner in the works.
I saw it in a dream, as vivid as these flames I saw it. A male babe, born to me.
He's plagued with doubt, truly believing his dream to be real, but not wanting to spurn his beloved daughter, his last connection to Emma. If they'd caught the White Hart in the end, perhaps he would have decided to choose Aegon, once more letting signs and prophecies guide his way. But they didn't, and killing the stag so horribly is what I think convinces him not to go ahead with it, and remain on Rhaenyra's side. Speaking of Rhaenyra, she makes her own decisions, running away from the constant demands and observation of her station, killing the boar but ultimately sparing the White Hart, returning to camp bloodstained and unkempt, this time completely unbothered by the stares of the crowd. She's resolved to seize her own power by her own means, learning not to rely on anyone else's support. The contrast of Harwin grinning at her and Jason going, ew, is the cherry on the cake. Of course, when she does as she wills and forges her own path, the burden of how she failed to meet the expectations placed on her starts to grow heavy once again. Throughout Laena's wake, she has most people trying to avoid her, but Vaemond and later Alicent just don't stop fucking staring at her. This time she's learnt the consequences this negative perception has on her life and is once again made uncomfortable by the crowd. As for Daemon's struggle with expectation, his lack of dialogue throughout his scenes in the episode forces you to pay attention to his expressions and physicality and how others react to him. We've been over the former in his character study, but as for the latter, you see the looks the soldiers give him as he walks up to the table, with Vaemond dissing him as he approaches. No one loves him. No one even likes him except maybe Corlys and Laenor, but he is someone to be feared, someone to listen to, so they all wait in silence, watching him as he reads Viserys' letter, waiting to see what his next move is. Just like Rhaenyra, he rejects Viserys' offers and goes off on his own, committing acts of violence and emerging victorious to the admiring eyes of the crowd. But also like Rhaenyra, he didn't do it for them. He did it for his own pride. He brings the expectation back around to Viserys, surrendering the weight of Draehar's hammer and his own crown, placing them both on his brother instead, while the crowd watches on to see how Viserys will react to this. Daemon gives up on such public shows in the years that follow, choosing instead to watch from the shadows and fringes until it's time to perform shocking murders, but the eyes will follow Rhaenyra her whole life, starting with the gazes following her as she walks through the castle after giving birth. Except this time, she's contrasted to Aegon. He bears the weight of his own family's expectations, which he's failed to meet for his entire life, and turns away from the responsibility Alicent demands he accept gratefully, quite literally looking out the window away from her, as she tells him to
have the decency to look grateful.
God, it's amazing how little empathy she has for people in the same position she used to be when she was younger. Even as he's crowned, he looks back, wanting to run away. He feels unworthy of the responsibility his family places on him, and he's dreadfully aware of the loathing they have for him, given Helena's little half curtsy and Aemon's tiny nod, while the adults graciously but coldly bow their heads. But then, he receives the unconditional acceptance of the crowd, and he turns to face them, reveling in their adoring gazes. Except for this one guy, I love him. Rhaenyra has her own moment in the next episode, being crowned and received by the crowd. A smaller crowd than Aegon's, of course, but a crowd that looks up at her nonetheless. Just like Aegon, she reels at having finally been officially given the love and responsibility she struggled with denying and wanting for her whole life. The last time she wavers under the weight of expectation is in her first council meeting, looking around the room at all these lords and knights, and especially at Daemon, having so often had the men in her life speak over her, undermine her, patronize her, objectify her, ignore her, and insult her. But now they patiently wait on their queen, and after a moment's hesitation, she jumps right in. As great as this moment is for Rhaenyra, she's already off to a worse start than Aegon, and it's because of something I've been touching on throughout this whole video, one of the central themes of the entire show: perception.
The truth does not matter, Rhaenyra. Only perception.
Game of Thrones was always a bit topsy-turvy about whether or not it matters what the small folk think. Jorah has his line about how
the common people pray for rain, health, and a summer that never ends. They don't care what games the High Lords play.
Which is supported by the rioting in King's Landing later. Like everyone else, they'll defend the status quo that benefits them and turn on the nobles as soon as that changes. We're repeatedly shown that the small folk accept whatever narratives they're told to believe, like the preachers throughout the series and the performances at the Purple Wedding and in Braavos. But the main impression I get from it is that they're not really invested in politics for ideology or their own self-interest, but in the way that real people, I'm told, watch the Kardashians. The drama. Yes, it's politically loaded, but so is everything. As the show goes on, they move further and further into the background, gradually becoming more like NPCs, quietly toiling away and meekly shuffled around the place by the powers that be, without any protests, and occasionally serving as a message that collateral damage is a negative side effect of war.
Sit with that one for a minute.
Overall, I'd say Game of Thrones doesn't think common people as a collective wield power, but individual commoners such as Bronn can wield power, which honestly, examining that sentence alone could be its own essay. House of the Dragon, however, despite being primarily focused in its first season on the political machinations of the royal family, is very firmly on the side that the small folk have significant power. Not only do you have Mysaria reminding Otto of the same thing Jorah believed, that the common people must comply with the feudal system for it to work, and how she wields her political capital for the purpose of social justice in King's Landing. But you also have the scene where Daemon and Rhaenyra watch the play, which is much less concerned with the drama of recent events than the implication those events have on the future prosperity of the realm.
Would she make a powerful queen, or would she be feeble?
It's more than just entertainment, it's political punditry, closer to the Daily Show than the Kardashians. Daemon tries to impress upon Rhaenyra that this all matters, that Rhaenyra needs the people she rules to be on her side, which is telling given how irreverent and fucking evil the man usually is. But Rhaenyra has always dismissed the small folk.
Their wants are of no consequence.
She's just recently emerged from her experience on the hunt, resolving not to give a shit about what anybody thinks of her. And likewise, she's craving freedom after her humiliating tour to find a husband. All those pressures and expectations I spoke about earlier extend to the small folk, so of course she'd reject their wants. She apparently never lets that opinion go, or at least tacitly teaches the same ideology to her sons by maintaining the lie of their birth.
You are a Targaryen. That's all that matters.
While Luke is concerned by people watching them, Jace says that it
doesn't matter what they think.
Having learned from Rhaenyra that even the obvious fact that they're bastards, so obvious that this little kid realizes it, has no power over them. Much like Otto and Alicent, she's just passed her bullshit down another generation, for them to make the same mistakes she did. In later seasons, we're very likely to see some commoners make some very impactful decisions as a collective, but I'll leave you to watch or read that yourselves. But in the present, most other characters in the show recognize that their perception of power and legitimacy in the eyes of the common people is crucial for victory in the impending succession crisis, which is why the Greens put on such a show for Aegon's coronation. Ushered into the dragon pit, a crowd of peasants obediently watched the coronation play out. Cacao Nibs the Kingmaker makes particular note of the seven bearing witness and all of the symbols of Targaryen royalty during the proceedings.
The crown of the conqueror, passed down through generations.
Which Otto brings up again later in his peace talks with Rhaenyra.
Aegon Targaryen sits the Iron Throne. He wears the conqueror's crown, wields the conqueror's sword, has the conqueror's name. He was anointed by a septon of the faith before the eyes of thousands. Every symbol of legitimacy belongs to him.
This comes before his claim that the Stark, Tully, and Baratheon houses will back their claim, showing just how important these symbols are. When Rhaenyra first hears news of the coronation, she and Rhaenys are fully aware of the impact this will have for her claim.
They crowned him before the masses.
So that the masses would see him as their rightful king.
And for a while, it seems like Rhaenyra can't get a win. Between this, Visenya's death, and a lack of open support from the Velaryons. That is, until the Rick brings her Viserys' crown and swears his allegiance. He's just one man, and the crowd is relatively much smaller than Aegon's, but again, it's the optics that matter more than the substance. That one man is a Kingsguard, now Queensguard, a shining beacon of the values of honor in Westeros. The crown is the same worn by the previous two kings, Jaehaerys the Conciliator and Viserys the Peaceful, now passed to his named heir, and the crowd serves as witnesses, recognizing these symbols and acquiescing to Rhaenyra's authority. This is the leg up Rhaenyra needs to prove that she has allies despite the Green's treason, and that she carries her own symbols of legitimacy. All of this is to say that the Iron Throne isn't a massive chair made of swords, positioned on top of a raised dais because Aegon the Conqueror had edgy emo boy aesthetics. It's because the appearance of power matters more than actual power, something Game of Thrones was extremely preoccupied with.
Knowledge is power.
Power is power.
Power resides where men believe it resides.
Give us common folk one taste of power, we're like the lion who tasted man. Nothing is ever so sweet again. Men decide where power resides, whether or not they know it.
Until it wasn't.
Power resides where men believe.
Shut your mouth.
It's an idea grappled with right from the beginning of Hot D, with Daemon stating that
Much of King's Landing is seen by the small folk as lawless and terrifying.
as justification for his brutal terror tactics. He believes that harsh punishments are the best deterrent for crime, perhaps thinking of examples Aegon made in his conquest of Westeros, like Harrenhal and the Field of Fire, which prompted Torrhen Stark to surrender the North without a fight. More than most, Daemon seems to understand the power of appearing strong, which is surprisingly perceptive of him, given his love for the literal power of dragons and belief that they'll win with them alone. When he's preparing Dragonstone for attack, he notes,
We don't have enough men to surround the island, but we can make ourselves appear stronger than they are.
demonstrating his understanding of perspective in military strategy. It's one of the many reasons he throws an absolute hissy fit when Viserys offers to send him help in the Stepstones. Not just because he hates to be pitied by his brother, but also because the whole world would see him as someone in need of help. You can even see how the specific wording of Viserys' letter would be taken as an implicit statement that Daemon is a failure.
Know that it is not my desire to see you fail in your cause.
Which he simply won't stand for. This is something Viserys also seemed to understand, but never practiced himself because he's a fraidy cat who never wants to hurt anyone or their feelings. He outlines to Rhaenyra that Targaryens tend towards glass cannon builds more than tanks, with Rhaenyra expressing her own understanding of the illusory nature of their power. Yet throughout his reign, Viserys takes L after L, weakening the perception of the crown's power over and over again.
At the moment, the crown is perceived as being vulnerable.
During the First War in the Stepstones, Otto points out that
were he to intervene now after so long, it would make the crown appear weak.
Which of course Viserys eventually decides to do. It makes other people around him uncomfortable, seeing the king so visibly weak, most notably in the scene where he proposes marriage to the Velaryons. Corlys has gone to all this trouble to make a good number of little power plays, including refusing to officially greet the king, waiting on his own throne to receive him in a hall dedicated to his own successors, and deliberately and slowly stepping down to Viserys' level, forcing him to look up at him, all of which Lionel, a genuinely honest and loyal man, takes offense to. But it's all pointless because Viserys is so outwardly weak, coughing and faltering. Corlys looks completely thrown, almost upset to see him in such a state. Lionel's made uncomfortable because as Hand, he's conscious of the king's image and how this is negatively affecting it. Rhaenys is likewise put off by Viserys wincing in pain as she grabs his injured hand, now missing a few fingers, and comments on how weak it makes him look coming here in the first place. Eventually, it just becomes sad when he does try to be intimidating, infuriating, like he does in the argument over Aemon's eye. Between his diminished physical frame and the constant and flagrant undermining of his authority, no one respects him, and his tantrum-like shouting and stamping has the opposite effect he likely wants. The effect is completed by the time of the petitions over Corlys's heir, with Alicent having removed all the Targaryen heraldry from the Red Keep, all the dragons sequestered away in the Dragon Pit, the king's seat now occupied publicly and privately by high towers, and Viserys himself shuffled away in bed, ironically behind a monument to the destroyed Valyria. Targaryens are no longer the power they once were. As with everything we've been talking about today, the broad themes are fantastic and beautifully expressed, but they're nothing without the characters that embody them. When Jace and Luke arrive at the training yard at King's Landing, they each note their impressions of its size.
Smaller than I remember. It looks exactly the same.
As the younger, a much greater proportion of Luke's life has been spent away from here, so the yard looks comparatively much smaller to him than Luke, who was much more grown the last time he was here. Everything is in the eye of the beholder. Corlys is a great one to look at when talking about how perceptions change over time as a result of experiences. In his pride and ambition for the throne, Corlys never considers the human cost of politics, only the gains and losses of power. Rhaenys calls him out repeatedly for placing their descendants in danger as a result of his political scheming, and hiding behind the excuse of her rejection by the Great Council as a motivation for his efforts. But he seemingly doesn't understand why she wouldn't want everything he strives to achieve. So when he tells Luke that one day he'll be the Lord of Driftmark, he's absolutely dumbstruck when the kid is upset by the prospect, given that for him to take the position, both Corlys and Laena would definitely need to be dead, and if they're dead, odds are Rhaenys and Rhaenyra would also be dead, or on their way out. Following the recent deaths of his real father Harwin and his aunt Laena, death is already haunting Luke, and Corlys genuinely thinks that the thing that would cheer him up is telling him about all the cool shit that he'll inherit when everyone else also dies. It takes decades, the apparent deaths of both his children and brother, constant pressure from Rhaenys, and his own near-death experience to finally change his mind. He launches into the speech we talked about from Rhaenys' perspective, about how he's done with trying to reach the throne, that the Velaryons will stay neutral, finally coming around to her way of thinking, but tragically too late. Baela and Rhaena are both betrothed to Luke and Jace, and to abandon their cause now would be to abandon the last family they have left. When he arrives on Dragonstone to make the final decision of whether or not to support Rhaenyra, he looks to his family, first to Rhaenys, and then the children, stood together as one unit. There's no separating them now. Rhaenyra's Targaryens are his family, and Corlys has sworn to protect his family at all costs.
You have the full support of our fleet and house.
It's fair to say that not everyone is so transparent with their intentions as Corlys. Not everyone can afford to in the first place. Whether you're gay, a woman, or lowborn, you need to put on some kind of front if you're going to make it amongst the noble lords of Westeros. Half the Game of Thrones is hiding your true thoughts and feelings and figuring out or exposing your opponents. Viserys is caught directly between two very similar men trying desperately to do just that. Daemon and Otto are constantly trying to turn their king against the other in order to serve their own interests. Daemon to fulfill his Valyrian desire for a brutal, monolithic, incestuous regime of dragon riders, Otto to manipulate the king into equating Hightower interests with the good of the realm. The language they each use to describe the other is the same. Speaking ill of Daemon, Otto says,
"I'm sorry, Your Grace, but that is the truth as I see it."
While when doing the same about Otto, Daemon says,
"I've only ever spoken the truth. I see Otto Hightower for what he is."
Each presents their insecure perception of their political rival as truth rather than opinion, and each, I think, truly believes it. The only thing that they can ever seem to agree on is how glad they are that Vaemond is dead. The idea of the sins of the father, of generations inheriting their forebears' conflicts, comes up once again as Alicent and Rhaenyra echo the same dialogue used by their father and uncle respectively.
But now they see you as you are.
Alicent has finally slipped up, and slipped up hard, ruining the outward appearance of perfection and purity she worked so hard to maintain.
Already the word is spreading, the gossip speculating that I've gone mad.
Otto, level 99 twat nozzle that he is, stokes that fire by encouraging and praising her for her attempted murder and child mutilation.
"I've never seen that side of you, my daughter."
Even while everyone else, including Alicent, sees her act as shameful, Otto is so into how she wanted to stab someone. He even throws Rhaenyra's line back at her.
"You see her for what she is."
And Alicent, in this moment of isolation, will take any support she can get, even Otto's fucked up support. At the absolute worst end of this, you have Aegon, who isn't even even necessarily hiding his true nature. It's just that everyone ignores him to the degree that there's an entire episode dedicated to people looking for him and finding out his kinks. He's now suddenly become someone who people need to pay attention to, and they don't like what they see.
You see now what he is. You've not seen everything.
Aegon serves to me as a great contrast to Viserys, whose true nature has likewise been ignored, having spent decades trying to get everyone to just be a little nicer to each other, but everyone dismisses him as weak and ineffectual. He hides the toil and trauma that power has had on him behind smiles and de-escalation, physically manifested in it literally eating away at his body, wasting him away as the years go by with his family hating one another, until finally, in a desperate, suicidal move, he takes off his mask and demands that they look at him.
I wish you to see me as I am.
This act of gently forcing them to acknowledge what's become of him, where before it was weakness, now he wields it as strength. He's literally bearing it all, deeper than skin, and they have to see it, see him, and acknowledge his unconditional love. And am I crying again? Rhaenyra and Alicent can't resist that either, and they immediately put their grievances aside.
For the sake of this old man, who loves you all so dearly.
Other characters, particularly Rhaenyra and Alicent, share Viserys' dissonance between the way they're seen and the way they'd like to be seen. A theme of Rhaenyra's early life is her struggle to be seen by Viserys.
I want him to see me as more than his little girl.
She constantly has to fight to be heard and respected, not just by her father, but by the other lords at court. It's not until she shows up on Dragonstone to face off against Daemon, appearing unconcerned when he brings up the risk to her life, that he finally sees her as grown up and capable. Alicent deals with her own issues of double consciousness, and again, I can't put it any better than the actual writers of the show did.
I like to believe I'm still the Lady Alicent, but all anyone sees when they look at me now is the Queen.
This feudal society has strict requirements for individuals, especially women, and in the process it strips away one's personhood. But like everyone else, she has to hide behind her pretenses, which leads to her run-in with the spy master Larys. There's a huge undercurrent of spies and the transmission of information through them in the series, just like there used to be in Game of Thrones. Here we have Talia, this lady whose name I don't know, and various other sus-looking servants reporting to Massaria, Otto, and God knows who else. Not Larys though, he's obviously skin-changing the rats around the castle. That line Otto says that we covered earlier.
I'm sorry, Your Grace, but that is the truth as I see it.
I feel that sums up so many people, seeing the same events and filtering them through the lens of their own truth, before passing it along to impressionable others, like a horrific game of telephone. Whether it's deliberate or instinctual, characters in the show are rarely outright lying. They're interpreting things in disparate ways, or making use of valid information for their own gain. But there's no point talking about anyone other than Otto here, since he's the Lord Commander of misrepresentation and manipulation. For a start, there's the manner in which he relates the Air for a Day incident to the small council, deliberately framing it as a joyous occasion. It's notable that we never actually get to see Daemon deliver the line, allowing you, the audience member, to decide how he intended it. Perhaps it's also designed to make you empathize with Viserys' struggle with Daemon, having your only source of this kind of information being so clearly self-interested and possessing a vendetta against Daemon, but for it to also be 100% in keeping in Daemon's character to do the horrible things he's accused of doing. If that was the idea, the showrunners did a hell of a job. Misreading intentions is rife throughout the whole show. Viserys, at least at first, takes Alicent's affection as genuine and falls for her, though he later realizes that he's been manipulated by Otto. Rhaenyra assumes that Viserys' insistence stems from a desire to marry her off to appease some lord and make room for Aegon as heir, but in no small part it actually comes from a desire to see an end to her solitude and unhappiness, and she's surprised by his offer to let her choose a husband for herself. Daemon takes Viserys' offer of a court position as pity, which it partly is, but it's stemming from brotherly concern rather than superiority. Viserys assumes that Lionel will be as openly self-interested in his advice as the other lords, pitching Harwin as a match for Rhaenyra, but he surprises Viserys by suggesting Laenor instead. Ostensibly, Larys thought that Alicent genuinely wanted the other Strongs dead. That's obviously a lie, but it is his stated reason. Alicent was never prying for a confession from the Cranberries, but he goes ahead and leaps to conclusions, politely requesting that she kill him instead of cutting his dick off. Then, after she decides to do neither, probably leaving Klinklang insanely tense and confused, he thinks that Joffrey is blackmailing or threatening him, so he punches him into oblivion, when in actuality he was, quite cuntily, proposing an alliance. Back to Otto though, and he later reports on Daemon and Rhaenyra's little incest adventure in much the same way as the Heir for a Day, albeit after much hesitation.
Daemon and Rhaenyra were seen together
in the bowels of a pleasure den.
One such as Rhaenyra, who already balks at the constant pressures, expectations, and watching eyes of the lords and ladies of court, and the small folk below, is understandably vexed at having had even more invisible eyes keeping watch, while she thought she was free to do as she pleased for once in her life. It makes her expectedly furious at Otto, and she insists that he be dismissed in exchange for the restriction of being made to marry Laenor. Otto isn't doing any of this out of some vision of a better realm. It's a mixture of his personal ambition to put his own descendants on the throne and to advance the interests of House Hightower. In what, as far as I remember, is the only scene between the two brothers, Hobart is clearly pressuring his brother to use his position as hand to manipulate Viserys for their own ends.
I don't know that His Grace sees it so clearly.
Then it lies with you to make him see it.
What's great about this line is that it exposes the artificiality of perspective, its malleability, and when he fails to change Viserys' mind, Otto instead attempts to change Alicent's. The language is all the same.
You're no fool, and yet you choose not to see it.
Otto spends the entire show manipulating the way other characters see things, and yet he accuses Alicent of affecting a willful ignorance of the approaching danger, rather than simply disagreeing with his fucked up little worldview. In doing so, he actually does succeed in changing Alicent's mind, sowing the seeds of fear and doubt before departing from court, which are then watered by Larys and his conniving shitbaggery, and finally brought to fruition in her confrontation with Cesare. It's all one massive pipeline of spies, misinformation, and manipulation that destroys any trust or faith in an individual. Beyond the actual career spies, we have a good number of other people spying throughout the series. Take Alicent again, looking in on the conversation between Viserys and Otto as he reports the brothel incident, indicating her increasing interest in her husband's politics, as well as her concern for her friend. It contrasts wonderfully with Rhaenyra listening in on Lionel and Harwin's argument about the scrap in the yard. These women aren't invited to these conversations, so they listen in on the fringes. Similarly, Rhaenyra lurks around the wake, watching the conversation between Daemon and Viserys, not wanting to be seen seeing, which you can take a couple of different ways. One is that she's watching Daemon, who she hasn't seen in a decade and still probably nurtures a crush for. Another is that she's trying to gauge how the two seem with each other, given the strife between them at almost every other meeting we've seen on the show. I'd say it's the first one, given her eyes follow Daemon as he leaves, and she immediately goes off after him. An even more ambiguous one is the confrontation between Daemon and Rhaenyra at the wedding. Viserys and Alicent both notice how crazy up in each other's personal space the two of them are, and being only a short time after their previous dalliance and Rhea's suspicious death, they both know how this could play out from here. Viserys in particular looks so gobsmacked, like, nah, absolutely not. Not today, you cannot be serious. But then the crowd moves in the way, obscuring whatever, if anything, occurred between the two of them after Daemon grabbed her by the neck. Given the continued association of neck touching between the two of them throughout the show, I'm sure we can guess at least where it was headed. Looking back over the show's plot, accidents and misunderstandings make up most of the drama and drive a good number of the characters' actions. There's obviously the heir for a day and the incest pub crawl, which both get Daemon banished and create bad blood between the Targs. The knowledge that Melos delivered moon tea to the princess makes Alicent believe that she lied about having sex with Daemon, which technically isn't true. Luke and Arax's deaths are an accident, at least as far as Aemon's intentions are concerned, but it'll be seen as a murder. Not just any murder either, but the murder of a diplomatic emissary and kinslaying, one of the greatest sins possible to commit in this world. Viserys' dedication to, and misunderstanding of, his dream of a son is arguably the first piece of wood thrown on the trash fire that is the succession crisis, and more directly results in Aemma's death. Misreading prophecies that result in someone's downfall is almost a running joke in the books, and fiction in general. The animosity between the Velaryons and Rhaenyra's branch of the Targaryens stems from the incredibly sus way Laenor was murdered, and Rhaenyra marrying Daemon like the next day, implying that they had a hand in it. Which is of course incorrect, they faked Laenor's death. Carmen Elizabeth Juanita Coscay Brava Cortez seemingly kills Beesbury accidentally, and Alicent's justification of the coup is down to her misunderstanding Viserys, thinking that all his talk about prophetic dreams, Aegon, and the prince that was promised are referring to their son Aegon. Honestly, I'm starting to think that the Great Council was actually a massive cock-up, like a La La Land Moonlight situation, like all the Lords of the Realm voted for Rhaenys, but they mixed up the announcement scrolls, and everyone was too embarrassed to say that they're the woke feminist lord who voted for Rhaenys. And here, for the final part of the video, is where I want to talk about the cinematography, especially in the episodes directed by Sapochnik, and how it drives home the show's themes. Elemental forces and symbols that pertain to the Targaryen experience, like fire or the Iron Throne, dominate the frame, sometimes providing a visual representation of a character's feelings. In particular, death is a throughline commonly associated with candlelight, but more often overshadowing the individual completely. Personal desires that were once clear are thrown out of focus when placed in the context of the Game of Thrones. Concepts like power, duty, and the realm hang over the heads of characters, and the camera looms from the highest seats in the kingdom, further influencing behavior and mirroring the struggle for personhood within a feudal society that cares so little about the individual's wants and needs. It's an isolating experience, and characters are often depicted as being totally alone, even amongst a throng of other people. Characters are often depicted as boxed off, sequestered into confined positions, mirroring the narrow roles they're forced to occupy in the world and the lines drawn between one another. Throughout the whole show, significant portions of a shot are obscured by out-of-focus people and objects in the foreground. It speaks to the shady nature of things in this environment, the smoke and mirrors of politics, and the secret schemes and illicit affairs constantly going on behind the scenes. It's controlled obscurity in King's Landing, however, and controlled obscurity in the camera work, so it's striking when the noise and bustle escalates into pure, incomprehensible chaos. Even light, the thing that's usually supposed to reveal, is used to deliberately blind you or silhouette people in frame, speaking to the tactics of spy masters like Otto, Laris, and Missaria, using selective delivery of the truth to deceive. In certain episodes, it's more uncommon to have a conversation filmed in perfect clarity, usually revealing that this is one of the rare conversations bereft of any deception, and naturally our sweet, perfect Prince Lionel Strong occupies many of these. In the most extreme examples, and some of my favorite shots in the whole show, characters in sharp clarity peek out from between walls of blur and distortion. There's all sorts of reasons this happens. Sometimes it's to emphasize a character's loneliness, and other times it's to show that a character feels like they've been forced into an uncomfortable position. Sometimes it's because a character is literally spying on people, or because they're a character kept on the fringes, forced to look in on the action. The camera is so often placed on the observers of scenes, not the characters driving the action, because in their own way, they are the ones driving the action. Their act of observing is what makes it real, much as the camera's act of observing literally makes this show real. This version of the observer effect drives the characters, makes them insecure and act differently, makes them put up masks and pretend to be things they're not, causes them to hide from being seen, hide who they really are, to crave the liberation of anonymity, which in turn invites others to pry and spy and gossip, feeding back into the behavior-altering self-consciousness that plagues the characters. It's a horrible cycle of watching and being watched. We're unlikely to see the same level of mystery and moral ambiguity in the next seasons of the show, what with it being an all-out war. While politics will still be an important aspect of the show, courtly scheming will probably mean much less than the large-scale alliances and straight-up dragon fights. That's not to say that there won't be any. There's plenty of mysteries in the book that could be clarified or left in the dark, but I'd be surprised if there was the same level of open interpretation. I reckon it'll be closer to the tone of seasons 2 to 4 of Game of Thrones, while the War of the Five Kings is going on and the show is still, good. At least for now, here in the first season, the text and the subtext of the show are beautifully harmonized. It's obscured, ambiguous, and mysterious. It's about truth, lies, and spin, full of deception, manipulation, and interpretation. The beauty of most of the things I've talked about today are that they're so open to interpretation. You could easily make valid arguments in favor of the exact opposite of many of my claims, and indeed many have. Even the meaning of the show and its characters is up for debate, and I love it for that. But with all the ambiguity in and around this show, one thing is absolutely certain. I cannot fucking wait for season 2. Well, that took a heckin' long time. For a moment I was nervous about making something this long purely about the looks characters give, but then I remembered what this fandom has been dealing with for a decade now. The gods have yet to make a Song of Ice and Fire fan who lacks the patience for more content. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. Please do sound off in the comments if you have any looks I missed that you loved. Better yet, I'd love to hear if you interpreted any of these differently to me. I really do love the ambiguity in this show, and hearing all the different perspectives on it. Subscribe Subscribe to UDS Films if you'd like to see more videos like this, and check out our sister channels, UDS Gaming and UDS Music. The names are pretty explanatory. My name's Drew.
I am the god of chits and wine.
And I'll see you in the next one. Okay, so Yaz is currently reading the Arsewife books for the first time, and while she has watched the show before, she's pronouncing names differently now, having seen them rather than heard them, and it's ruining my life. For instance, Lysa and Catelyn. She called them Lisa and Caitlin, and it's perfectly valid, and I'm fucking furious about that. It was all downhill from there, because once the pronunciation was fucked, the nicknames started in. Danny ain't shit. Our headcanon now is some white trash soap opera, where Caitlin and Eddie live in Winterfell, with their sons Ricky, Robbie, Johnny, and Brandon, before their old friend Bobby comes to town, featuring Pete, Tommy, Mel, Jimmy, Stan, Marge, Jill, Ellie, Dave, and of course, Sandy.